The most powerful military on Earth just got publicly rejected, not by one country, not by two, but by every single allied nation it asked for help. And the most telling part isn't the rejection itself. It's what happened 48 hours later. Because after days of threatening, demanding, and borderline begging allies to send warships to the Strait of Hormuz, Donald Trump walked into the Oval Office on Tuesday, sat down with the Irish Prime Minister, and told reporters, and this is a direct quote, "We don't need any help, actually. That is one of the fastest foreign policy reversals in modern presidential history." On Saturday, he was naming countries on Truth Social and telling them to send their navies. By Monday, he was telling the Financial Times that NATO faces a very bad future if they refuse. By Tuesday, he was insisting he never needed them in the first place. Something is breaking inside the American alliance system. And we need to talk about what happened, why it happened, and how Iran is quietly using the wreckage to reshape global power in a way almost no one in Washington appears to have anticipated. Let's start with the rejections, because the speed and the unanimity of them is unlike anything we have seen in the post-Cold War era. Trump started by calling on China, France, Japan, South Korea, and the United Kingdom to deploy warships to the Strait of Hormuz. He posted it to Truth Social on Saturday. When no one responded, he broadened it, calling on all countries that receive oil through the strait to help protect the passage. When that produced nothing, the language changed. White House Press Secretary Caroline Leavitt told reporters these countries should help because they are, and this was her exact framing, benefiting greatly from the United States military taking out the threat of Iran. Let that sink in for a second. That is the White House telling allied governments that a war they were not consulted about, and in many cases actively opposed, should now be treated as a shared project because those nations happen to benefit from the outcome Washington wants. And then it escalated further. The State Department sent a cable to every U.S. embassy on the planet directing American diplomats to tell foreign governments, at the highest appropriate level, that they must move expeditiously to diminish the capabilities of Iran. That is not partnership language. That is the language of a government that launched a war alone and is now discovering in real time that it cannot manage the consequences without help. Now let's walk through the responses, because the details matter more than the headlines. The United Kingdom's Prime Minister Keir Starmer held a press conference and said Britain would not be drawn into the wider war. He explicitly stated that this was never envisioned to be a NATO mission. He talked about consulting with allies, working on a viable plan, and focusing on restoring freedom of navigation, all of which is diplomatic code for, "We're not sending warships while bombs are still falling." Trump's response was personal. He mocked Starmer for telling him he needed to consult his team before making a decision. The sitting president of the United States publicly ridiculed the leader of America's closest ally for following the most basic principle of democratic governance, talking to your cabinet before committing your military to a foreign conflict. Germany was even more direct. Defense Minister Boris Pistorius gave what might be the most devastating single-sentence rejection of an American military request in NATO's history. He said, "This is not our war. We have not started it." But it was the spokesperson for Chancellor Friedrich Merz who delivered the deeper cut. Stefan Cornelius told reporters in Berlin that the United States and Israel did not consult Germany before the war, and that Washington explicitly stated at the start of the conflict that European assistance was neither necessary nor desired. Read that again. The US told Europe at the beginning that it didn't need help. 3 weeks later, it is demanding that same help, and Europe is quoting its own words back at it. France took a slightly different approach, but the result was identical. Emmanuel Macron said France would never take part in operations to open or liberate the Strait of Hormuz in the current context. That last phrase is doing all the heavy lifting. In the current context means during active hostilities. So Macron has effectively agreed to nothing during the only window that matters. He's waiting for the war to end, and once it ends, the strait reopens on its own anyway. Trump's response to Macron was to note that the French president will be out of office soon, which is the diplomatic equivalent of hanging up mid-sentence. Spain's Defense Minister Margarita Robles delivered what might be the sharpest rejection of all. She said Spain will never accept any stopgap measures because the objective must be for the war to end, and for it to end now. That is a sitting NATO defense minister telling the United States that the solution to the strait crisis is not a naval coalition. It is ending the war that caused it. Italy's foreign minister said diplomacy must prevail. Australia said the United States has not formally asked for support, and that it is not prepared to offer it. Japan said it is reviewing options within the scope of Japanese law but has no plans to send ships. Poland and Sweden said they had no intention of joining. South Korea said it was reviewing the situation. Greece said no. And then the European Union weighed in as a body. Foreign Policy Chief Kaja Kallas gathered EU foreign ministers in Brussels and said afterward that nobody is ready to put their people in harm's way in the Strait of Hormuz. She added, with a precision that must have stung in Washington, that the main concern of European countries is that they were not consulted before the war started, and that in fact many Europeans tried to convince the US and Israel not to start it at all. The only country to express something close to willingness was Ireland. Taoiseach Michel Martin, sitting next to Trump in the Oval Office, confirmed that Ireland would get involved in securing the strait. But Ireland is not a NATO member, has a small navy, and the commitment came during a bilateral meeting where the political cost of saying no to Trump's face was higher than the practical cost of saying yes. The broader picture is unanimous. Not a single major military power committed forces, and several are now openly negotiating with Iran to get what Washington promised its coalition would provide. But the rejections are only half the story. To understand why every single ally arrived at the same conclusion independently, you have to look at the structural reasons underneath. Because this was not just about politics or optics. This was a calculation, and the math points the same way no matter which capital you are sitting in. The first reason is consultation, or rather, the complete absence of it. In the days before February 28th, Allied governments received no meaningful input into the decision to strike Iran. Some were given vague warnings. None were asked for approval, advice, or operational coordination. The German Chancellor's office said publicly that Washington told Europe at the start that it did not need European help. Callas confirmed that multiple European leaders actively tried to talk the US and Israel out of launching the strikes. They were ignored. And now, barely 3 weeks later, those same leaders are being told they must move expeditiously to help clean up the consequences. The Wall Street Journal reported this week that the administration planned to announce a convoy coalition, but buried in that same reporting was the detail that the nations involved are still debating whether operations would begin before or after a ceasefire. If the coalition only activates after the fighting stops, it's not a wartime alliance, it's a press release. The second reason is the relationship itself. For years, Trump targeted these same allies with tariffs, withdrawal threats, public insults, and NATO funding ultimatums. He pulled out of the Iran nuclear deal. He called the alliance obsolete. He imposed trade penalties on European steel and aluminum. He ridiculed Macron, Merkel, and Trudeau on the global stage. And now, the first time he genuinely needs their military cooperation, he is not asking, he is threatening. He told the Financial Times that NATO faces a very bad future if countries do not comply. He told reporters that NATO allies were making a very foolish mistake. Senator Lindsey Graham said he spoke with Trump and had never heard him so angry in his life. But anger is not leverage, and every government on that call list knew it. A European diplomat told NBC News something that captured the entire dynamic in a single sentence. He said, "He's asking us to help for a war he started. There is not much enthusiasm for this." The third reason is domestic. European voters are overwhelmingly hostile to this conflict. Energy prices were already painful from the post-Ukraine era, and they have now spiked further. Brent crude has surged past $100 a barrel. The average price of a gallon of gasoline in the United States hit $3.60, up from $2.94 before the war. But in Europe, the pain is sharper. Natural gas is spiking because Qatar's liquefied natural gas, which European nations pivoted to heavily after cutting ties with Russian supply, ships through the same waterway that is now effectively sealed. Any European leader who sends warships into the Persian Gulf alongside the American Navy is ending their own political career. Robles in Madrid understood that. Pistorius in Berlin understood that. Starmer in London understood that. They are not being cowardly. They are doing the math. The fourth reason runs even deeper, and this is the one that infuriates Brussels more than anything. The war is directly enriching Russia. Callas said it publicly. Every dollar oil climbs above 70 is another dollar funding Moscow's campaign in Ukraine. NATO's primary strategic concern is Russia. The war Trump is waging against Iran is financing the adversary that NATO actually exists to confront. And here is where the contradiction becomes almost impossible to paper over. The United States is simultaneously granting sanctions waivers allowing India and other nations to purchase Russian crude already at sea. Trump is asking European capitals to send destroyers to the Gulf while his own Treasury Department greenlights Russian oil sales. The contradiction is not subtle, it is policy, and every European foreign ministry sees it clearly. Now, even if every European leader suddenly woke up tomorrow and decided they wanted to help, which they do not, the military problem alone would make this coalition nearly impossible. And this is the part that most people skip over because they assume American military power can solve anything. It cannot solve this. The geography is against it. The Strait of Hormuz is only about 21 nautical miles wide at its narrowest point, and Iran controls the mountainous northern shoreline. Tehran has spent decades preparing for exactly this scenario. Its Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps fields anti-ship ballistic missiles, fast attack craft, submarines, naval mines, drones, and a coastal missile network hardened over 40 years of preparation. The U.S. military itself has acknowledged destroying at least 30 Iranian mine-laying vessels near the strait since the war began, which tells you how quickly any escort mission turns from a patrol into a shooting war. Iran's IRGC Navy chief responded to Trump's coalition call by saying the Americans falsely claimed to have destroyed Iran's navy, then falsely claimed to have escorted oil tankers, and are now asking others for backup. That line landed because it was true. U.S. Energy Secretary Chris Wright posted on social media that the Navy had successfully escorted an oil tanker through the strait, then quickly deleted the post. The White House later confirmed the claim was not true. Any escort mission would not be a patrol. It would be a sustained military operation inside a corridor where Iran holds every geographic advantage and where even a single missile strike on a tanker could send insurance rates so high that no commercial vessel would agree to make the transit regardless of how many warships surround it. Naval analysts have pointed out that all Iran needs to do is strike occasionally to keep insurers away, and without insurance, ships do not sail. That is the fundamental asymmetry no coalition can overcome with firepower alone. And then there is the precedent that no defense ministry in the world has forgotten, the Red Sea. The Houthi disruption was a smaller-scale preview of this exact scenario. A non-state militia with a fraction of Iran's capabilities shut down one of the busiest shipping corridors on the planet. 2 administrations launched strikes. Biden admitted the strikes were not working and continued them anyway. Trump did the same and eventually walked away. The Red Sea was never fully secured. Every allied military strategist drew one conclusion from that. If the full power of the American Navy could not reopen the Red Sea against the Houthis, no patchwork coalition is going to hold the Strait of Hormuz against the IRGC. And now, with the Red Sea also disrupted again, the Houthis resumed attacks after the October 2025 ceasefire collapsed. Both of the Middle East's major maritime corridors are simultaneously blocked for the first time in modern history. Shipping companies like Maersk, MSC, CMA, CGM, and Hapag-Lloyd have all suspended transits through Hormuz. The Cape route around the southern tip of Africa is the main alternative, adding weeks to transit times and massive costs to every shipment. Maritime tracking data now shows traffic through the strait is down approximately 97%. Only 21 tankers have transited the route since the war began on February 28th. Over 400 vessels are sitting in the Gulf of Oman waiting. Thousands of seafarers are stranded. The U.S. military itself has admitted it is not ready to escort commercial ships. That is not a scenario where allies volunteer. And now we reach the part that almost no one is talking about, the part that changes everything. Because Iran is not just blocking the strait. Iran is using the strait as a sorting mechanism, a diplomatic lever designed to pull American allies away from Washington and closer to Tehran, and it is working. On March 5th, the IRGC announced that the Strait of Hormuz would remain closed only to ships from the US, Israel, and their Western allies. Everyone else is free to pass. And then Iran proved it. A Pakistan-flagged tanker loaded with Abu Dhabi crude became the first confirmed non-Iranian cargo vessel to transit the choke point while broadcasting its location. 2 Indian LPG carriers passed through safely after Prime Minister Modi spoke directly with Iranian President Pezeshkian. A Turkish vessel received clearance from Tehran after Ankara negotiated directly, with 14 more Turkish ships still waiting for approval. China is in direct talks with Iran for guaranteed passage of its crude and Qatari LNG shipments. Dozens of vessels have begun broadcasting Chinese ownership or crew presence on their identification systems while operating in the Gulf, essentially waving a Chinese flag to signal to Iran that they are not aligned with Washington. Even more striking, ships are now routing through Iranian territorial waters, not the standard international navigation channel, with Tehran's permission. Maritime intelligence firm Windward tracked at least 5 bulk carriers taking this new Iranian waters route over a 48-hour window. Nearly all of them had previously called at Iran's Imam Khomeini port. The blockade is not just closed. It is being selectively opened, and each opening is a transaction that strengthens Tehran's position. This is the strategic maneuver that almost no one in the administration appears to have anticipated. Iran has converted the strait from a military choke point into a diplomatic lever that is actively peeling allies away from American leadership. And it is not a blunt instrument. It is surgically precise. India gets passage because New Delhi has long-standing ties with Tehran, and 80% of India's LPG imports flow through this corridor, meaning 333 million Indian households depend on it for cooking gas. Turkey gets passage because Ankara maintains a pragmatic relationship with both sides. China gets passage because Beijing is Iran's largest oil customer, and the economic relationship is too valuable for Tehran to disrupt. Pakistan gets passage because Islamabad shares a border with Iran and has maintained neutrality. Each of these arrangements is a bilateral deal. Each one strengthens Iran's position as the gatekeeper, and each one is a quiet humiliation for Washington. Follow this logic to its conclusion. Every allied capital now faces a binary choice. Option 1. Join an American convoy mission, guarantee that Iran classifies your ships as hostile targets, and accept the military risk of operating inside a 21-mile corridor against an adversary that has been preparing for this fight for 4 decades. Option 2. Negotiate directly with Tehran, stay out of the war, and keep your oil flowing. Washington is offering its partners the privilege of becoming combatants. Tehran is offering them the privilege of becoming customers. For any government making that calculation, the answer is obvious. And here is the part that makes this a genuine strategic crisis for the United States. The UK and France have reportedly opened back-channel talks with Iran about securing their own vessels. These are two of Washington's closest allies, members of the Five Eyes Intelligence Alliance, permanent members of the UN Security Council, and they are negotiating directly with the adversary that the war was supposed to eliminate. Every nation that negotiates with Iran for safe passage is implicitly recognizing Iranian authority over the waterway. Every successful transit arranged through Iranian channels is a quiet rejection of American power. The alliance is not just failing to assemble, it is being disassembled from the outside. And the economic architecture underneath all of this is collapsing in parallel. The International Energy Agency announced on March 11th the largest emergency reserve release in its 52-year history, 400 million barrels from 32 nations. The United States alone is contributing 172 million barrels from a strategic petroleum reserve that currently holds only 415 million. That is 41% of America's entire emergency stockpile, released in a single decision, and it did not work. Crude climbed more than 17% in the days following the announcement. Brent briefly touched $120 a barrel before bouncing between 80 and 100 in the days since. The IEA said oil export volumes through the Strait are currently less than 10% of pre-war levels. That is not a disruption. That is a near-total shutdown of the most important energy corridor on the planet. Global LNG supply has been cut by roughly 20% because Qatar, one of the world's largest LNG exporters, ships through the same choke point. Qatar Energy declared force majeure on all LNG shipments on March 4th after Iranian attacks on its Ras Laffan facilities. That single event removed a fifth of global LNG supply from the market overnight. This directly undermines Europe's effort to replace Russian gas, which has been the cornerstone of EU energy strategy since 2022. The supply gap is estimated at roughly 12 to 15 million barrels per day, and no combination of reserves, pipelines, and alternate routes can close it. Analysts at Rapidan Energy Group said IEA drawdowns can at best offset only a fraction of the net supply loss. Others at Commonwealth Bank of Australia warned that Brent could surge toward $150 a barrel if physical shortages materialize, which would force demand destruction across developing economies. That is a polite way of saying the world's poorest nations would simply stop being able to afford fuel. The regional picture is fracturing faster than anyone projected, and this is where the conflict stops being a Middle Eastern story and becomes a global one. Dubai International Airport, one of the busiest aviation hubs on Earth handling nearly 90 million passengers a year, has been struck by Iranian drones multiple times since the war began. A fuel tank fire from a drone hit forced a temporary shutdown of operations on March 16th. Some flights were diverted to Al Maktoum International, others turned around mid-route. Airlines like Air India, Emirates, and Polish carrier Lot have cancelled or rerouted flights across the region. Air freight rates have surged as much as 70% on some routes. Middle East tourism, worth an estimated $367 billion a year, is hemorrhaging. The UAE has faced over 1,800 missiles and drones since February 28th, more than any other country targeted by Tehran in the conflict. Saudi Arabia has been intercepting waves of drones in its eastern provinces. Qatar intercepted drones and issued elevated security alerts. Kuwait's airport and radar equipment were damaged. Abu Dhabi suspended operations at a major gas field after a drone attack. The Ruwais industrial complex, which houses the UAE's largest oil refinery producing over 900,000 barrels a day, was hit, forcing ADNOC to shut it down. The UAE's entire airspace was temporarily closed as a precautionary measure. The U.S. Embassy compound in Baghdad was targeted in what Iraqi security sources described as the most intense assault since the war began, with at least 5 drones used in a single wave. These are not isolated incidents. This is a sustained campaign against civilian and energy infrastructure across an entire region, and it is happening while the United States cannot find a single ally to send a ship, so put the full picture together. The assumption before February 28th was that this would last 4 days and end in total Iranian capitulation. The Strait would stay open, allies would fall in line, oil would barely move. The reality is that we are now in week 3. The Strait is under effective Iranian control. Oil has breached $100. The largest emergency reserve release in history failed to stabilize prices. Every Allied capital that Washington contacted rejected the request publicly and on the record. The assumption was regime collapse. The reality is that the son of the assassinated supreme leader, Mujtaba Khamenei, assumed power within days and declared in his first public statement that the leverage of blocking the Strait must continue to be used. He called on Gulf states to shut down American military bases. The assumption was that a coalition would form quickly, escorts would begin, and global trade would resume. The reality is that not one nation has committed a single warship, and several are now negotiating directly with Tehran for the access that Washington promised its coalition would provide. But Iran's position is not as strong as it looks on paper either. Tehran framed its closure as total, as the reality is selective, passage granted to nations willing to deal bilaterally. That is not a blockade born of unshakable strength. It is a calculated gamble that depends entirely on the war not escalating to the point where Iran's own coastline becomes the front line. If the administration moves toward a ground seizure of Karg Island, which handles roughly 90% of Iran's crude exports, Tehran's leverage over the strait evaporates overnight. Iran's entire strategy requires that escalation does not reach that threshold. Whether that bet holds depends on decisions being made right now in rooms we cannot see. And so the only question left is this: who decides what comes next? Is it Washington, which launched this war alone and is discovering in real time that alone is where it will stay? Is it Tehran, whose selective blockade is reshaping alliances faster than any military strike could? Is it Beijing, whose ships are already passing through the strait under negotiated terms, quietly building an economic relationship with Iran that could outlast this conflict by decades? Or is it the dozen allied governments that have just told the most powerful military on earth that this is not their war, and that the way to solve the problem is to stop the fighting, not to join it? There is something deeply historic happening here that goes beyond the daily headlines about oil prices and drone strikes. The American alliance system, built over 80 years, maintained through the Cold War, expanded after the fall of the Soviet Union, and tested repeatedly in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Libya, is being stress-tested in a way it has never been before. Not by an enemy attack, not by a rival power, but by the decisions of the United States itself. The Allies are not leaving because they were forced out. They are leaving because they were never invited in. And the nation that spent decades building the architecture of global security is now standing inside it alone, wondering why no one else showed up. That question does not have an answer tonight, but the fact that it needs to be asked at all tells you everything about where the world stands right now. Thanks a lot for watching. I really appreciate your support. Join the discussion in the comments. Let me know. Who do you think is winning this war, and what do you think happens next? Do you think any nation will eventually join the coalition? Drop your thoughts below. And please subscribe, hit the bell, and click the video on screen to stay updated on this story